Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, Assistant Minister of Congregational Life. These programs are conversations with community organizers, artists, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources. Today, I'm joined by Chuck Freeman, Executive Director of the Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry. The Texas Legislature began meeting last week, and the Justice Ministry is an important way that Unitarian Universalists let our elected officials know how they can reflect our values with their votes and actions. Now, according to their website, the Justice Ministry is guided by Unitarian Universalist principles and educates and organizes member congregations and partners with sympathetic organizations in order to advocate effectively for public policies that uphold the worth and dignity of every person, further justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, ensure the use of the democratic process, protect religious freedom, and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence. So Chuck, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for inviting me. I'll claim that I'm a scholar. How about that?
Okay, perfect.
Not a gentleman, but just a scholar.
Well, before we talk about what's happening now and the current events, let's talk about how the Justice Ministry was formed and what your particular role is and how congregations throughout Texas can partner with you.
Yeah, well, about this time in January of 2012, we met at my congregation. Let me just back up a little bit. That's back in the days when we had what was called the district executive named Susan Smith. And there's some folks there in Houston and others around Texas who called her and said, hey, what if we get a legislative ministry in Texas? And she said, well, you need to call Chuck Freeman. That's what I was always sounding off on blogs and radio shows and stuff like that about the intersection of spirituality, religion, and politics. At any rate, about a dozen of us met at the Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Church up in Cedar Park, where I was at the time. And we actually formed a steering committee and got the Justice Ministry going. And then we got a small grant, and I ended up becoming our first executive director, and I've been doing that ever since, I guess, 2013.
That's great. So how many congregations throughout Texas are now partnering with you?
Yeah, we have 36 of our congregations now who we're in covenant with and collaborating with, part of our coalition.
I know the ministry is both a 501c3 and a 501c4, which means you were permitted to endorse candidates this last season, or this last election, rather. Tell us about that and some of the other good work that you've done lately.
Yeah, well, just for people who don't know about that alphabet soup you just mentioned, 501c3 is the kind of the standard thing that for educational purposes. So most nonprofits from the IRS are designated 501c3. And then and that's tax deductible. Then there's a 501c4, which we also have had for a long time. That allows you to do direct political organizing. So we've had that sitting there for a number of years. And finally, we had enough bandwidth, and we felt like we were mature enough organizationally to begin to use that. So this time we called it our Values Voting Recommendations. And 13 of the candidates that we recommended to our congregations and constituencies won election this time.
That's great. So how did you determine which candidates that you would back?
Well, the first thing we did was there were like a number of races that pretty much everybody who was watching the political scene thought, these are the toss-up races. These are the races that are going to make the difference in the direction of the legislature, more than particularly the House. There wasn't that much in play in the Senate. So we basically took the issues that our congregations voted on, and then we looked on their websites. We looked at other allies who had endorsed them, and just basically to see if those are people who represent the kind of values that we advocate for.
Right. So like you said, to see which people reflect Unitarian Universalist values in the way that you would predict that they might vote and work for their constituents.
Yeah, and then we took the issues, and more specifically, the issues that our congregations had voted on, and looked, through their materials to see how they stood on those. But you can tell pretty quick looking at somebody's site kind of where they're coming from,
Sure. Well, I was going to ask you in a minute, so I'll go ahead and do that, about the member congregations voting on specific issues that they'd like to see the Justice Ministry focus on with the elected representatives. So tell us about you asking the congregations about the issues, and how you hope to prod the legislature to work on these issues.
Well, we had a deliberative process by which our member congregations first gave nominations. So this was about, 2 or 3 month process. They gave nominations, and then we had everything, on a ballot, so to speak, and then they voted on the issues. So we want our issues to reflect what our grassroots congregations in Texas really want to be working on together, as Unitarian Universalists in the state of Texas.
Definitely. So what are the ones that they named that they definitely want worked on?
Yeah, so it was in this order: racial justice, environmental justice, healthcare access, economic justice, and voting rights justice. So those are, in that order, those are the ones that our congregations voted on.
And obviously there are many more things that need our attention, but those are certainly top ones that we can hope the legislature focuses on this time. Well,
the other thing too, Scott, is that we always say this, and this is what we always do as well, is that just because something isn't on our top 3 or top 5 list that was voted on by our congregations, if something comes up that's close and near and dear to our heart, close to the core of our values, we're not going to go, oh, well, that wasn't one of our issues, so we're not going to do nothing about it. Of course we're going to get involved in it, and we have historic issues like reproductive justice, LGBTQ justice, immigration justice. We're going to work on those things. So just because they weren't voted in this time, we're not going to drop those off, because we know those are historically very important to our congregations.
Sure, and it strikes me that some of these kind of reflect some of the things that were under attack recently, so they're foremost in people's minds.
Yeah, and that was, we're very cognizant of that the vote reflected what's going on in the culture, and obviously the horrific things with George Floyd and others with the racial justice voting there.
Well, you've anticipated my next question, because I was going to say, I know there's some major issues before the legislature this year, one being the George Floyd Act. And the legislature, yes, as I mentioned, began meeting last week. What are some of the big major issues before the legislature this year?
Well, let me just say regarding that we're going to be working with members of the Black Caucus and others to get that George Floyd Act into a committee, heard, out of a committee and voted on in both the House and the Senate for that to be approved. And what I'm hearing is that due to the horrific events on January the 6th in Washington, D.C., that actually might make the passing of this more possible than it was before, because people are, now they're awakened by these kind of horrible actions and seeing that this is more of a white supremacist kind of movement going on here, even those who would not want to acknowledge it heretofore. I'll answer that question in two ways, though. So I'm on the board of Texas Impact, and Joshua Houston, one of their.
Can you say what that stands for? What those organizations are?
Texas Impact is the oldest interfaith organization in Texas. It's kind of the mainline and Abrahamic faith. So we have Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, and of course others like us, and they're Unitarian Universalist. So I serve on the board of that. Joshua Houston, who's one of their lawyers and main lobbyist, he said in our meeting this past week, this is right about from around Christmas, these were the top three things in terms of the number of bills filed. And it surprised us. Number one was health care. Number two was election law. And number three was racial justice. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean a thing in terms of things getting passed. But what it does tell you is that there are enough legislators who are interested in those three items that they filed enough bills for those to be the top three.
Wow. Now,
when you get into what's going to happen, what are the priorities of the big three, that being the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House? Of course, budget's always number one. That's the only thing they've got to do. By the Constitution, they have to pass a budget. So if that's all they did, then they would have fulfilled their responsibilities as legislators. But anyway, budget, redistricting, and the pandemic. I think those are going to be according to the big three, those are the three things they're really going to laser in on, focus in on. And of course, the redistricting they've got to do too, because of the national census.
Oh, right. Let me back up a moment. For those who aren't familiar with it, what are some of the specific things mentioned in the George Floyd Act, and how would that change how policing is done?
I haven't read the George Floyd Act, so I can't answer that specifically. I'm just listening to the Black Caucus members talking about it, but it has to do with more responsible and more accountable policing, and recognition of racial bias and things of this nature. So, and of course these chokeholds and things that have cost people their lives.
Right. I think some of them revolve around the chokeholds, the body cameras, people being police officers having the responsibility to step in when they see one of their colleagues overstepping their bounds. There are things like that that are included in it, to my understanding. So,
well, you know more about the specifics of it than I do. I've been kind of looking at the big picture right here, and now we'll start drilling into the specifics of things. By the way, only about, I think there are usually around 6,000 bills filed, something to that effect. And generally around 20% of those will become law. So there's a whole lot of stuff that people put out there, for their constituents that will never A lot of them won't even get a hearing. But we certainly are going to work towards this George Floyd Act and other things like this that bring more equity to our policing. We just have to have those kind of reforms.
Right, and reforms on a statewide level. There's so many differences between different cities and counties within the state that it can be problematic as well.
Yes.
You mentioned healthcare and the pandemic. Do you know if expanding Medicaid will be on the radar at all? I know that's been a real bugaboo with Texas.
Well, we're kind of surprisingly hearing, and even from some folks who have been entrenched against this for years, that this might be the year to get a breakthrough on Medicare expansion. And the other thing we're hearing, and you'll hear this, Scott, that the divide, if you will, in Texas is not so much Republican and Democrat, but urban and rural. That's one of the primary tension points in the state of Texas regarding our priorities and legislation. And so what we're hearing and knowing is that the rural areas are really in a bind with their health care, with their medical facilities, with their hospitals. And of course, the pandemic's only made that worse. And so I'm hearing now a lot of the rural people, rural representatives are beginning to speak out, saying we have to do something for our Texans out in the rural areas.
I can totally understand that. I can speak from personal experience with my in-laws who lived in West Texas that the access to quality health care out there was certainly not, as you can imagine, what it was in Dallas-Fort Worth. And so
exactly.
We ended up moving them there. So there's a lot to think about with the medical, especially now with the disparities we've seen with the pandemic.
Yeah, so, you got places like, Lubbock's not a small town, but, they were overrun. They were having to, get their people out. They didn't have enough ICU beds, In El Paso, even though, once again, not a small town, but it is rural Texas, having to get 8-10 refrigerated places for bodies and things of this nature. It's just,
it was horrible.
Refrigerated morgues, essentially.
Yeah, it made the national news. It was so bad out there.
Yeah. So, point being, rural Texas, West Texas in particular, but East Texas too to some degree, and South Texas. There is a cry there so I think that could portend well for Medicaid expansion. And that's been one of our issues since we founded in 2012. We've been working on that.
Yeah, I think perhaps people can tell. It's been highlighted with the pandemic what a hugely important issue that is.
Yeah.
Are there any other major issues before the legislature that you want to let us know about?
Well, we'll just have to see. There, it looks like there's a whole lot of pandemic-related bills. So what does that look like? And then related to healthcare access and helping people with funding and things like that. So it's, the thing about the legislature is it starts very, very, very slowly, and then it ends in a whirlwind. So, they're just now beginning to form their committees. Of course, they elected a new speaker, Dave Phelan from Beaumont, and the scouting report we're getting on him is that he is kind of a throwback to Strauss, so to speak, in the sense that he does want this to be a deliberative body where the elected officials chart the course, and they're able to, in other words, he's just not trying to run roughshod over it and have an authoritarian speakership, but he's really big on, this is the people's house, and we want what happens in the House to reflect their representatives and their priorities for their districts, etc. So that will be a positive thing. Of course, in the Senate, it's just the opposite with Mr. Patrick there ever since he's been elected. In fact, the first thing he did, the Democrats picked up one seat in the Senate, which would make it, you'd think that wouldn't make a big deal, but that would make it harder for the Republicans to get their bills to the floor. And so they changed the rules. That was the first order of business. They changed the rules. So now they can get bills to the floor for a final vote without any Democratic Party agreement.
Wow. So
that's Mr. Patrick's MO. That's the way he operates, is top-down, authoritarian. I'm the guy in charge. I'm going to run the agenda. I'm going to tell you what's important, and you guys kind of follow in lockstep, and then trying to minimize or silence the minority party.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see what happens with the legislature this year. But I also want to talk about that doesn't happen year round, or even every year, I don't think. So what does the Justice Ministry do to engage the elected representatives at other times?
Yeah, well, so the Texas Legislature meets every other year for 140 days, assuming there's no special session. So, that leaves a whole lot of time that you think, well, we don't have anything to do. But, a lot of things we do aren't necessarily with elected officials, but they are with the systems of Texas, or the systems of our nation even. So, we worked a whole lot on immigration justice. We have 3 people in physical sanctuary here in Austin. Oh. And so some of our Texas UU Justice Ministry board members are now founders and leaders in the Austin Sanctuary Network. We have Ilda and Yvonne, her son, in physical sanctuary in St. Andrew's Presbyterian here in Austin, and then Alidio Gamez at First Unitarian Church in Austin, First UU Church of Austin. So we've worked a lot to try to get them a stay so they can have their freedom. And we, of course, during this administration, that's been a brick wall. But like, we had a woman, Sulma Franco, who was in physical sanctuary at First Unitarian Church during the Obama administration. And we ran a campaign. We were able to get her deferment in like 2 or 3 months. And so that means lobbying ICE, going to the ICE office, one of the regional ICE offices in San Antonio, and getting allies, religious allies, other allies together, and putting pressure on that people of goodwill and good heart and good conscience are advocating for these people. One of the other things we're doing is that because of this depraved and cruel Remain in Mexico policy, which, basically cut off our international obligations for asylum, we have worked with the UUSC in particular, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We have a grant working with a pastor who is providing housing and food and transportation for people in Nuevo Laredo. These are people who've come, from Central America, etc., looking for an asylum hearing. They've been stuck there now, for, I don't know, a year and a half or more. But we have helped to provide not only money, but spiritual support, emotional support, food, blankets, air conditioners, heaters, things of this nature. So that's been one of the primary things we've worked on, and we've asked our congregations to become, immigration justice congregations, and to be a sanctuary type and that's on a continuum of a lot of different things that they can do.
So it's clear that the work that you do has real effect and really helps real people. It's not any kind of just working on bills and legislature that people may not see for years. It's real-time help for real-time people. That's really wonderful.
Yes, and let me just mention too, Scott, we've just started a new relationship with the Carrizo-Comecrudo tribe in South Texas, some of the oldest inhabitants of this continent, going back into the 1500s before the Spanish conquest and all the other conquests that followed from Europeans. But we are working with them, once again, for this nonsensical border wall, for that to be stopped going through their sacred lands, and then they're running these gas pipelines from West Texas, etc., through their sacred lands. So we've had a conversation series that just ended this past Friday, being listening and being educated from the tribe about all the issues, and then now we're getting ready to start galvanizing and mobilizing people to weigh in on these hearings through the various federal and state agencies for these pipelines and walls and what have you.
Wow. Yeah. Sometimes people think of those pipeline problems being up in the Dakotas and stuff, but it's a problem down here as well.
There's a bunch of them running through here, and that's one of the things the tribe's been doing. They've been driving all over, documenting these things because they try to hide it.
Oh.
The powers that be try to hide it and do it by stealth. And sometimes you're supposed to have public meetings, and those are hardly even made known to the general public. So they might make it known in a small area, and a few people might show up and they said, oh, we did our due diligence. So that's one of the things they're trying to do, and we're trying to work with them to do, to make that more well known, get more people, Unitarian Universalists and other people of good heart and goodwill and good conscience, to weigh in on these things and let them know we're watching them, and that we are going to try to, get that stopped.
Well, that's wonderful. Just more good work that you're doing. Thank you so much. We're about to run out of time, but I do not want to go before people can find out where to get more information and to donate online to help advocate for these public policies that reflect our UU values. So please tell us what your website is, how people can donate to you, and how they can get on your mailing list.
Yeah, so you can just go to TXUUJM.org. And by the way, instead of talking about donations, I talk about investing, because you are investing in our shared values being spoken and being worked for in the public square and all across the state of Texas. So we also obviously have a Facebook page. Just go to Texas UU Justice Ministry on Facebook. Those are the best places to find us. If you want it, we have the little MailChimp newsletter. You can just email me at chuckfreeman2@gmail.com, and we'll get you on that. But we cross-post that onto our Facebook page and also onto our Twitter account.
I love that it's an investment rather than a donation, because you're absolutely right.
Yes.
It's an investment in the future of our state, for our children and grandchildren, for it to be better for everyone who comes after us. So thank you for that opportunity to invest in that, and for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
I so appreciate you taking this time to tell us about the work you're doing. So, and I hope you get a lot more interest from our talk today. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your leadership there, you and Reverend Colin and the group there at First UU there in Houston.
Thank you. For those of you who are with us on the Ministers Forum for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It is posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. Dr. Bosson will again be preaching this week. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We will see you all online soon and in person as soon as it is possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.